The world's largest ethnic group has one name, one flag, one origin story. There's just one problem. The DNA says that story never happened. Look at this city, Shanghai. 2025. Nearly 25 million people walking the same streets, eating from the same food stalls, speaking the same language, all carrying the same identity label, Han Chinese. 1.4 billion people, one name, one story. And that story goes like this. Thousands of years ago, a great civilization was born along the Yellow River. A mythological king called the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, fathered the Chinese people. They farmed the riverbanks, built the first cities, invented writing, and became the world's most ancient, most unified ethnic group. Clean story, simple story, taught in every Chinese school since the day the first textbook was printed. There's just one problem. It's not true. Not completely, not even close. In 2019, a team of scientists at the Kunming Institute of Zoology analyzed DNA samples from more than 20,000 unrelated Han Chinese people spread across every province in the country. Lead researcher Professor Kong Qingdong published the results in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution. And what he found quietly turned everything upside down. The Han Chinese do not trace back to one river. They trace back to three: the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, the Pearl River. Three separate populations, genetically distinct from each other, that developed independently for thousands of years, and then slowly, violently, gradually merged into what we today call one people. The professor himself said it clearly. The history of Han Chinese is more sophisticated than thought, and that is the understatement of 10,000 years. Because the deeper scientists look, the stranger and more beautiful this story gets. It is not a story about one bloodline. It is a story about three ancient civilizations that collided, survived catastrophe, got overwritten by empire, and left their fingerprints inside the DNA of 1.4 billion people who were never told any of this. So, before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you are watching this from. And have you ever done a DNA ancestry test? Because I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to want to. If you love lost histories and ancient DNA mysteries, subscribe. There are stories in these genes that no textbook has ever touched. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Not to dynasties, not to emperors. To a time 10,000 years ago, when two completely separate groups of people were living in the same country, and neither one knew the other existed. 10,000 years ago, China was not one place. It was two completely different worlds. In the north, along the Yellow River, a group of people had figured out how to grow millet, tough, drought-resistant millet that could survive the dry winters of northern China. These people built walled villages. They buried their dead with jade weapons pointing north. They worshipped sky ancestors. They were the Liangzhu culture, and they were thriving. 800 kilometers to the south, along the Yangtze River and its delta, a completely different group of people had discovered something else: rice. Flooded rice paddies in the warm, wet lowlands. And these were the people of the Liangzhu and Hemudu cultures. They built houses on stilts above the water. They conducted water-based rituals for their ancestors. They carved jade not into weapons, but into spiral dragon forms. Same country, two completely different languages, two different belief systems, two different food supplies, and, most importantly, two completely different genetic identities. In 2023, researchers publishing in Frontiers in Earth Science confirmed exactly this. Modern Han Chinese can be traced back to a mixture of Yellow River Basin ancestry from the north and ancient southern East Asian populations from the Yangtze, two distinct founding streams that ran parallel for thousands of years before they ever mixed. But here is what the textbooks skip over. These two groups did not merge peacefully over tea. My archaeological sites across the Yellow River Bend tell a harder story: smashed burial grounds, skeletal trauma, entire villages abandoned in a single generation. The northern millet farmers were pushing south, not with diplomacy, but with displacement. And the southern rice people were being pushed back, deeper into the delta, deeper into the forests and coastlines. A 2025 PubMed study on ancient DNA from the Yellow River Bend described it clearly. During the late Neolithic period, northern populations were expanding southward while simultaneously absorbing gene flow from the Mongolian steppe. The genetic map of China was being redrawn by force, but here is what made it complicated. The southern Yangtze people didn't just disappear. In the ones who survived, the ones who retreated far enough and fast enough, they carried something in their DNA that the northern farmers simply didn't have. Something ancient, something that predates both civilizations by thousands of years. Something that, when modern scientists finally found it hiding in certain isolated mountain communities, pointed to a journey so old and so far that it rewrote the entire origin story of East Asia. Here is a number that should stop you cold: 60,000 years. That is how long ago the first modern humans arrived in what is now China. Not 10,000 years ago, not 5,000, 60,000 years ago, a group of hunter-gatherers following the southern coastline of Asia reached the edges of East Asia and settled there. These were not the Yellow River farmers. These were not the Yangtze rice cultivators. These were the people who came before both, and their genetic signature, their specific mitochondrial DNA markers, has been sitting quietly in isolated pockets of southern China and Southeast Asia for 60 millennia, largely invisible to mainstream history. Scientists call them the ancient Southern East Asians, and in 2013, research published in the journal PMC on Y chromosome history in East Asia confirmed what some geneticists had suspected. These early arrivals did not come overland through Central Asia. They followed the ancient coastlines of the Indian Ocean, moving east along shorelines that have since been completely swallowed by the sea. After the last ice age ended, global sea levels rose by 120 meters. The roads these people walked are underwater now. Every camp they ever made, every fire they ever lit along that route, gone. They left nothing behind, except their DNA. And here is where it gets interesting. The indigenous peoples of Taiwan, the Aboriginal communities who lived in the mountains long before the Chinese mainland ever sent ships to the island, carry the clearest version of this ancient southern lineage. Their oral traditions say they came from the place where three rivers meet. Scientists once dismissed this as myth. The DNA says it is memory. But for decades, Chinese nationalist historians argued the opposite, that Taiwan's Aboriginal peoples are simply a branch of Chinese civilization that migrated to the island. A footnote, a peripheral population. The genomic evidence says the exact opposite is true. It is the mainland that absorbed the ancient southern people, not the other way around. And these coastal hunter-gatherers were in East Asia tens of thousands of years before the first millet seed was ever planted by the Yellow River. They are not a branch of Chinese civilization. They are part of its deepest root, and that root stretches further than China. It stretches further than Asia. But we'll get to that in a moment. First, we need to talk about the third group, because while the Yellow River farmers and the southern coastal people were building their separate worlds in eastern China, something was moving toward them from the north. Something on horseback. Something that would change the genetic identity of northern China more dramatically than any farming culture ever had. Picture the Mongolian steppe 4,000 years ago. Endless grassland, bitter winters, no cities, no writing, no jade. But these people had something the farmers to the south did not. Horses, bronze weapons, a shamanic religion built around the eternal sky, a supreme divine force they believed lived above the clouds, and the kind of mobility that allowed them to cover hundreds of kilometers in a season. These were the ancient Northeast Asian steppe populations. And between roughly 4,000 and 2,500 years ago, they began moving south, into the northern Chinese river valleys, into the territories of the Liangzhu millet farmers. In 2019, the Frontiers in Genetics study that analyzed 20,000 Han Chinese DNA samples found something remarkable buried in the northern Han genome. Approximately 25% of northern Han Chinese ancestry traces directly to Yakut-related steppe populations, nomadic herders from the Siberian north, not farmers from the Yellow River. 1 in 4 genetic units in a northern Han Chinese person comes from a Siberian nomad. That number is not in any Chinese textbook. A separate 2022 study published in Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution, focusing on Han Chinese communities in Liaoning province in the northeast, confirmed the same picture. Ancient Northeast Asian steppe ancestry is a dominant ancestral component of Northern Han Chinese, layered on top of Yellow River farmer DNA through centuries of contact and intermarriage. And these nomads did not just add their genes, they added their ideas. Linguists and archaeologists studying the earliest Chinese oracle bone script, the oldest confirmed form of Chinese writing, carved into animal bones around 1200 BCE, have noted that several of the earliest symbols for horse, sky, being and thunder carry structural similarities to Proto-Altaic steppe languages. Not the farming language of the Yellow River people, the sky language of the steppe, the Yellow Emperor mythology, the story of a semi-divine king who descended from heaven to teach the Chinese people farming, writing, and medicine, may not be pure invention. It may be a cultural memory of the moment when these sky-worshipping steppe elites arrived from the north, were absorbed into farming communities as high-status outsiders, and became, in the eyes of the people who buried them, something close to divine. Speaking of burials, in 2018, a genetics team in Beijing sequenced a 4,500-year-old skeleton from Gansu province. The man was a steppe nomad, confirmed by his genome, but he had not been buried as an enemy. He was buried with jade ornaments from Yellow River farming tradition, surrounded by millet offerings. He was buried as someone honored by a community that was not his own, among people whose genes were different from his, in a ritual that blended two worlds. This man had been, in some sense, adopted by a civilization, and his DNA went with him, into their children, their grandchildren, the generations that followed. Now, if the steppe horsemen arrived from the north and were absorbed upward into the elite class, what happened to the original Yellow River farmers? The people who had been there for 5,000 years before the horsemen arrived? The answer is buried in a stalagmite in a cave in southeastern China. And what it reveals is one of the most catastrophic chapters in human prehistory. In 2300 BCE, the most advanced hydraulic city on Earth was not in Egypt. It was not in Mesopotamia. It was on the Yangtze River Delta in eastern China, a place called Liangzhu. Liangzhu had tens of thousands of residents. It had a water management system, dams, canals, flood reservoirs, that modern engineers have described as extraordinary for its time. Its craftsmen produced jade objects of such technical precision that researchers today cannot fully explain how they were made without metal tools. And then, in the space of approximately 21 years, it was completely gone. No conquest, no burning, no army. It drowned. In 2021, a landmark study published in Science Advances, led by geologist Haiwei Zhang of Xi'an Jiaotong University, analyzed isotope records from cave stalagmites in southeastern China. Stalagmites grow in layers, year by year, and each layer records rainfall levels with extraordinary accuracy. What the team found was a catastrophic spike in monsoon rainfall between 4,345 and 4,324 years ago, a 21-year period of relentless, abnormal flooding that inundated Liangzhu's entire agricultural system and made the city uninhabitable. Liangzhu was not defeated. It was erased by climate, and it was not alone. A 2019 study in Science Direct documented that multiple Neolithic cultures across China, including Liangzhou in the north, collapsed around 4,000 years ago due to simultaneous climate disruptions, floods in the south, megadroughts in the north. The genetic diversity that had taken 5,000 years to build across the Yellow River and Yangtze basins was nearly wiped out in a single century. Two civilizations, two climate catastrophes, same era. The survivors regrouped. When they migrated, they mixed with whoever was nearby, and the genetic boundaries that had separated the Yellow River people from the Yangtze people, boundaries that had held for millennia, began to blur. Now here is where the story gets darker. When the Zhou dynasty rose to power around 1000 BCE, they did something every conquering power in history has done. They rewrote the past. The Zhou commissioned China's first official historical records, and those records traced Chinese civilization in a single straight line, from the mythological Yellow Emperor through a series of sage kings, directly to the Zhou themselves. Clean, unbroken, divinely authorized. The Liangzhu people were not in that story. The coastal ancestors were not in that story. The steppe horsemen were in the story only as enemies, not as genetic contributors. The real, messy, multi-layered truth of Chinese origins was buried under the mandate of heaven. But it could not be buried everywhere, because there was one region so geographically isolated, so far from imperial reach, that the original genetic record survived intact. A place where the mountains were so high and the passes so dangerous that Zhou scribes never arrived. And what researchers found there, thousands of years later, was a living archive, a genetic time capsule, sealed 8,000 years ago, never opened. In the mountains of Yunnan province in southwestern China, there are communities that the Chinese Empire never fully absorbed. The Yi people, the Naxi, the Bai, ethnic groups who speak languages unrelated to Mandarin, practice burial rituals unchanged since the Neolithic, and whose DNA, when scientists finally sequenced it, looked like nothing they expected. These populations preserved ancestral genetic lineages that had been diluted to near invisibility everywhere else in China. The Yellow River farmer ancestry was there, but so was the ancient southern coastal lineage, and underneath both of those, something older, something that didn't match any known ancient group cleanly. The genetic history of East Asians, as synthesized across multiple academic studies, confirms that the earliest human layers in this region trace back to deeply divergent lineages, an interior lineage from northern China's Paleolithic populations, and a coastal lineage related to the ancient Unga peoples of the Andaman Islands, one of the most isolated human communities alive today. Both threads survive in Yunnan's mountain communities. But what made researchers pause was not the DNA itself, it was the religious texts. The Yi people have their own writing system, a script that predates the Chinese characters used in Mandarin, and which remains only partially decoded today. Their creation mythology, written in this ancient script, describes the origin of humanity through three ancestor spirits, who came from three rivers and three ways of living, who eventually merged into one people. Three ancestor spirits, three rivers, three ways of living. A myth, or a 3,000-year-old memory of the actual genetic history that modern science is only now confirming? Here is what we know. When Chinese state geneticists arrived in Yunnan in 2015 to collect DNA samples from these communities, some Yi village elders refused. What they said their ancestors had warned them. One day, outsiders would come to claim their blood. The elders were right to be cautious, because the data that came back from those samples pointed towards something so unlikely, so geographically impossible, that the researchers admitted in their own paper they did not fully believe the result. The thread in the Yunnan genome did not just trace back to China. It didn't just trace back to Asia. It traced back to a migration route running along the bottom of Asia, a coastline 60,000 years old, that linked isolated populations from southwest China to the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean, all the way to Papua New Guinea in the Pacific. Three communities with no contact for tens of thousands of years, three completely different languages, religions, and cultures, and the same maternal DNA thread running through all of them. This next part is going to sound impossible. I need you to stay with me. The coastal migration theory, supported by Y chromosome research published in peer-reviewed journals, proposes that the first modern humans to reach East Asia did not travel overland through Central Asia. They followed coastlines, moving east from Africa through South Asia, hugging the Indian Ocean shore generation after generation, all the way to Southeast Asia and eventually East Asia. This journey took thousands of years, and the people who made it left virtually no trace on land, because the land they walked on is now underwater. When the last ice age ended, sea levels rose by 120 meters. Their camps, their tools, their footprints, all gone, but not their DNA. Specific mitochondrial haplogroups, genetic markers passed from mother to child, unchanged across generations, found in isolated southern Chinese minority populations, show a direct genetic link to the Unga people of the Andaman Islands. The Unga are one of the most ancient and genetically isolated human groups still alive today. Their ancestors branched off from the main human migration stream 50,000 years ago and stayed on those islands, untouched, ever since. And yet, their mitochondrial signature matches markers found in certain Han Chinese minority communities. These are not people who traded with each other. They are not people who shared borders or married across cultures. The Andaman Islands are thousands of kilometers from Yunnan. The match is not cultural, it is genetic, inherited, ancient. It means that somewhere, like 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, a woman walked out of Africa. She followed a coastline east. Her children followed, and her children's children. And eventually, two branches of her family tree separated, one settling in the islands of the Indian Ocean, one continuing east into China. Those two branches never saw each other again, never knew the other existed, built completely different civilizations. And today, the mitochondrial DNA of that single woman is inside both of them. It is inside isolated Pacific Island communities. It is inside Papua New Guinean Highlanders. And it is inside the genomes of Han Chinese people who have never left their province, who have never heard of the Andaman Islands, who have no idea they carry this thread. The deepest root of Han Chinese identity does not begin in China. It does not begin in Asia. But it begins on a coastline that no longer exists, with a woman whose name we will never know. And while all of this was unfolding, while farmers and coastal ancestors and steppe horsemen were layering their genes across the Chinese landscape, there was one more group, isolated in a desert no one wanted, living in genetic silence for 9,000 years, until 1988, when Chinese archaeologists brushed sand off a face that looked nothing like anything they expected to find in China. In the Tarim Basin of what is now Xinjiang, the westernmost region of China, the desert does something that deserts rarely do perfectly. It preserves. In 1988, archaeologists began uncovering mummies that had been buried in the Taklamakan Desert for 4,000 years. The dry, salty conditions had preserved them almost perfectly, and what they saw stopped them. The high nose bridges, deep-set eyes, reddish-brown hair, wool tartan textiles woven in patterns so similar to early Celtic and Scythian cloth from Europe that textile historians initially could not believe it. These people looked Western, European-featured, found in the geographic heart of Asia. For decades, the debate was fierce. Were they European migrants who wandered east, steppe herders from the Caucasus, part of an Indo-European migration? In October 2021, a team of international researchers led by Fu Zhang published the answer in Nature, one of the most respected scientific journals on Earth. The paper has since been cited 168 times. The Tarim Basin mummies were none of the above. They were not migrants from the West. They were not steppe herders from the East. They were the descendants of an ancient North Eurasian population, a group that had been living in the Tarim Basin in near-complete genetic isolation for 9,157 years before the mummies were even buried. The study calculated this with a margin of error of plus or minus 986 years, 9,000 years of isolation, in a desert. While the Yellow River farmers were building Liangzhu villages, while the Liangzhu civilization was constructing its great hydraulic city, while the steppe horsemen were moving south, this population sat in the Tarim Basin and mixed with no one, absorbed nothing, rejected all outside influence. But here is the twist that made researchers lean forward in their chairs. These people, genetically marooned, unknown to every surrounding civilization, were already practicing animal sacrifice rituals and dairy production, when they were already performing burial ceremonies, and the structure of these rituals showed striking similarities to practices found independently in early Chinese Bronze Age culture, early Indo-Iranian Vedic tradition, and early Scythian steppe religion. The same rituals, zero genetic contact, separate development. Either there was cultural exchange we don't yet understand, or certain human rituals emerge independently wherever people reach a certain point of complexity. Either answer is extraordinary. As for their Western physical features, the red hair, the sharp facial structure, the nature study explained this too. Their appearance came from their ancient North Eurasian genetic heritage, a population that was widespread across Eurasia during the Pleistocene epoch and has since almost completely disappeared. It survives today only fractionally, at about 40% in some indigenous Siberian communities and some indigenous American groups. The Tarim mummies had it at far higher levels than any living population. They were, genetically speaking, a ghost, a remnant of a world that no longer exists. And their language? Unknown. Their script, if they had one, never found. After the 2021 paper was published, traces of their specific ancestry were detected in the highland Tajik communities of the Pamirs, the mountain border region between China and Afghanistan, but almost nowhere else. They left a whisper, not a word. Now here is the part that takes this from ancient history to the present day. The Tarim mummies were found in Xinjiang, the same Xinjiang that today is the center of one of the most controversial government surveillance programs in the world. In 2016, the Chinese government began building one of the largest ethnic DNA databases in human history. Not for archaeology, not for ancestry research. Blood samples, iris scans, voice recordings collected from Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongolians, and dozens of other non-Han ethnic minority groups. The official reason given was public health research and disease prevention. In 2019, the New York Times reported that Chinese scientists had contributed Uyghur DNA samples to international genomics databases, potentially without the full knowledge or consent of the people who gave the samples. In January 2024, the Radio Free Asia reported that a genomics study based on Chinese minority DNA samples had been officially retracted after investigators found that the researchers did not obtain the necessary ethical approval before collecting the samples. Professor Yves Moreau of KU Leuven in Belgium, who had been raising concerns about Chinese minority DNA collection for years, identified multiple additional papers published in Western scientific journals, including one published by Oxford University Press that used data collected by China's Ministry of Justice from Uyghur subjects. Papers built on data collected from people who may not have agreed to be in any study at all. Now here is the deep irony at the center of all this. The very DNA that the Chinese state is collecting from minorities, the samples it is treating as evidence of difference, of separateness, of the need for surveillance and control, tells the opposite story. Every genome collected from a Uyghur traces back to the same ancient migration routes that built Han Chinese identity. Every Tibetan genome carries lineages that fed directly into the Yellow River ancestry now claimed as the foundation of Han civilization. The minorities of China are not genetically separate from the Han. They are, in many cases, the source material the Han was built from. In 2023, young Han Chinese users began sharing consumer DNA test results on social media platforms. Many discovered they had significant Mongol, Tibetan, Manchu, or Southeast Asian ancestry, percentages large enough to challenge the idea of a pure Han bloodline. The posts went viral. Then the censors arrived. Accounts were flagged. Posts were removed. But the state's message was clear. Some genetic truths are too politically inconvenient to trend, but you cannot censor a cell. You cannot ban a haplogroup. The DNA exists whether the government acknowledges it or not. And that brings us to the final question, the one that runs underneath everything in this video, the question that the science has been building toward for 20 minutes. Here is a fact that will stay with you. The word Han, the identity label for 1.4 billion people, the name of the world's largest ethnic group, the word at the center of Chinese national identity, was not chosen by a philosopher or a geneticist or an ancient sage. It was chosen by a peasant. Liu Bang was a minor government official from a farming family who rose through the chaos of civil war to become the first emperor of the Han dynasty in 206 BCE. He named his empire after the Han River, the small river in his home region of Hanzhong. Not after a bloodline, not after a god. After the river near the place where he grew up. A geographical accident of one man's biography became the identity of a civilization. Professor Kong Qingdong's study confirmed what the DNA shows. The genetic variation between northern and southern Han Chinese is just 0.03%, smaller than you might expect, given how different northern and southern Chinese cultures, dialects, and physical appearances can be. The cultural identity of Han ran far ahead of the genetic one. Language, ritual, the imperial examination system, Confucian social structure, standardized writing, these were the real tools that built the Han identity, not blood. A 2024 study published in Science Direct on the evolutionary history of Han Chinese populations confirmed that northern and southern Han carry measurably different genetic compositions. They are Han by culture, not by a single unified bloodline. The Han were assembled, built, engineered by empire over centuries. And what the empire used as raw material was three ancient civilizations, The Yellow River farmers, the Yangtze River rice cultivators, the southern coastal ancestors, layered over by steppe horsemen from Siberia, ghost lineages from the ancient coastline, and even the faint trace of a desert people with red hair who lived in isolation for 9,000 years and left no name for themselves. Every single Han Chinese person carries all of this inside them: a Yellow River farmer's stubbornness, a Yangtze cultivator's patience, a steppe horseman's restlessness, a coastal wanderer's ancient memory of the sea, and somewhere very deep, so deep it barely shows anymore, the ghost of a red-haired woman in a desert who looked at the sky every night and prayed in a language no one alive can speak. This is not a story about where Chinese civilization came from. It is a story about what civilization actually is. It is not a bloodline. It is a process, a collision, a survival, a forgetting. And now, for the first time in human history, a remembering. Because that is what ancient DNA does. It remembers everything, even the things empires tried to erase, even the things that were buried under 120 meters of water, even the things that lay in a desert for 4,000 years with reddish hair and a face that nobody expected. The Tarim mummies still lie in museum cases in Xinjiang, yet their language unknown, their name for themselves lost forever. But we know their genome, we know their face, we know what they ate, how they buried their dead, what textiles they wore against the desert cold. We just will never know what they called themselves. And maybe that is the most human thing about them, that they lived fully, completely, beautifully, without knowing that 4,000 years later, a scientist in a genetics lab would hold their tooth in gloved hands and ask, "Who were you? Where did you come from?" The answer is still being written in laboratories, in ancient bones, in the DNA of 1.4 billion people who have never been told the whole story, until now. In the next episode, the genetic origins of the Japanese, and why DNA evidence suggests the samurai ruling class and the rice-farming villagers they ruled over were, genetically, two entirely separate populations who were told they were one people. That story is coming. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it.